Okay, I think we're live now. Thank you so much. So my name is Lucky Buluela. I'm a professor in cancer medicine. I'm also the faculty of medicine lead for doctoral degrees and one of the two deputy directors, academic directors in the Early Career Researchers Institute, which is a new institute that we have in Imperial. But from my side, covers what we formerly called the graduate school. And you'll be hearing a little later on from the director, Liz Elvidge, who is the director for the postdoc and fellows development. Okay, so if we can move on to the next slide, please. Okay, so this is just a housekeeping slide to remind you about a few things. So first of all, this is a Microsoft Teams webinar. So actually the front end of what you're seeing may be slightly different to what you usually see on Teams. Your camera and microphones are actually switched off, but you are able to ask questions, and we would invite you to ask questions by using the Q&A panel to submit questions as text or indeed comments. The Q&A part will be moderated by my colleague Nasheen Tariq, who is the postgraduate education manager for the Faculty of Medicine. And Nasheen may be able to answer your questions directly, or you may have particular questions you want to direct at particular people in the members of the panel, or indeed to the speakers that you'll hear from in a few minutes. You have the panel biographies, which are been sent out with the schedule for this afternoon, and we'll put a copy of that into the chat so that you can access it if you don't have it to hand. Okay. You can actually also submit your questions if you want anonymously, and we will prioritize questions based on like votes. So questions which you read in the chat and see as something that you're keen to have asked, give it a vote, and then it pushes up, and so that it's more likely to get asked, particularly with early on in the sessions as we go into the questions. And finally, you can turn on the auto captions for this event. Brilliant. If we can move to the next slide, please. Okay, so this is just a brief summary of what's going to happen today. We're going to get a couple of short presentations, which will happen in a couple of minutes. There'll be a short break, and then there'll be panel discussions, which will allow you to ask through the Q&A portal questions breaking down into three areas, which is preparing your application or preparing for your application, writing an effective application, and then finally delivering a good interview. And hopefully through those and the discussions with the panel, between the panel members, you'll be able to get the insights that you need, and also answers to specific questions and queries that you may have. Okay. So if you don't mind, we can just move on to a little bit of introduction I want to make, if that's okay. So if we can move on to the first slide, please. Okay, so this slide is really about the PhD landscape. And that's really to give you some ideas of what types of PhDs and the kinds of fundings and opportunities are associated with them that exist out there. The most familiar ones are the ones that are project-led PhDs, and you'll see these advertised both online through findaphd.com, this kind of thing, but also increasingly less so, but in publications, in journals, and so on. So these are usually advertised by the host laboratory or the host departments, and these occur throughout the academic year. So they're not particularly targeting either the beginning or the end of the academic year. Then we have PhD fellowships. So institutions like ourselves, like Imperial, have their own fellowship schemes. At Imperial, we have a high-end fellowship program called the Imperial President's Scholarship, which I'm sure a lot of you would have heard of. And these are awarded to successful candidates to fund both their PhDs with stipends and with fees. But in our particular case, there's a small amount of money that's also given towards the running of the PhD projects themselves. In our case, it's a rolling opportunity throughout the year to apply. The scholarship committee meets, I think, 3 times a year, but it's open, applications open all the way through. Other institutions, you may find they're defined application windows, which you can easily find out about by going online. There are also opportunities to get scholarships of this type, which are part fees only. So these are ones that will help top up fees or will pay the fees only themselves. So there won't be a stipend involved with them. And we have a few of those within Imperial, particularly directed actually at PGT at the moment. Okay. Then we have institution PhD programs. So these are PhDs that are offered by research institutes. And at Imperial, we have a few research institutes embedded within the college. One that comes to mind for me is the Laboratory of Medical Sciences, the LMS. It's an MRC institute. And they get, as a result of their MRC support, a number of PhD allocations that they will then advertise on a competitive basis for students to apply to. So they're project driven, they're internally administered. They come usually with full stipend and fees. There are other institutions, such as the CRIC, for example, which run very similar programs with very defined calls. So the windows to apply and the subsequent interview processes are usually in a very tight window of opportunity. So it's best to look at the institutional websites to get an insight into when those will happen and what they involve. We have what's called doctoral training programs. So these are usually investments by research councils and charities to give the opportunity to have structured and themed PhDs in particular areas and so on. They're usually associated with large departments or whole institutions, and they don't necessarily mean that students end up being in one particular department or faculty. So for example, as I'll explain in a few minutes, we have a MRC doctoral training program that we call multi-site at Imperial. It is a doctoral training program that supports PhD students to carry out PhDs, which are cross-faculty, right across the college. And these are actually, that's actually fairly typical of the kind of DTPs that institutions like ourselves hold. Then we have centers of doctoral training, and these are slightly different in so much as they are much, again, supported by research councils and charities, but they're much more like departments within themselves. They also have associated with them support structures, administrative structures, and in some cases actually defined physical space. So again, these have recruitment cycles. Again, they will recruit to themed areas or to specific projects, and they will have defined calls for applications. Sorry, then we have case studentships. Now, case studentships are special examples of PhD studentships, usually funded by research councils, which also involve commercial partners. And there's commercial partners, and usually industrial partners. They can be small spin-out companies based either in and around Imperial or beyond. And what these commercial partners offer is the opportunity for students to do projects in a theme area to do with the commercial aspects of the company, where they are also collaborating with academics at Imperial, for example, to do the research. What it offers the students is usually an enhanced stipend, but also the opportunity to carry out training within that commercial organization. Now, with case studentships, which are funded by UKRI, that amounts to 1 month a year or 3 months in the 3 years overall. And some UKRI funding programs, actually, this is built into the program. It's a requirement of the program. So BBSRC funded studentships. There's an absolute requirement to do some sort of internship during the year. And if it's a case BBSRC, then it's absolutely required that is done as part of the timeline of the PhD, not in addition to. Okay. Then we have clinical research fellowships. So these are awarded to clinicians who are trained or are in the final years of their undergraduate training. They're usually advertised as an annual call, and they come usually from particular funders, UKRI, so the MRC, and charities such as Wellcome, the British Heart Foundation, CRUK, and so on. And so what these do is they offer the opportunity for clinicians to take PhDs where they're given a period of time where they move away from their clinical practice to do a PhD and then come back into that. There is the opportunity to continue doing some clinical practice while they're doing their PhDs because they're usually offered with some protected time. It's very small. It's usually about half a day a week or 1 day a week. And then finally, we have self-funded PhDs. And these really are where the cost of the PhD candidate is met by themselves or through some agency, which is not a granting agency. And they can be supplemented by part funding from fellowships and awards. So some of our self-funded students are actually also getting scholarships to help pay for the cost of their PhDs. Okay, if we can move on to the next slide, please. This is just to remind you that the MRC doctoral training program I referred to, the multi-site doctoral training program, is actually open at the moment for applications. It's a 4.5-year PhD program where the first year is a compulsory MRes year, which gives the opportunity to students to then do rotations to try and find the best match that the area they want to work in or specific groups or labs they want to work in. Our intake is actually largely coming from students who already have got a master's or an MRes. So this is an opportunity for them to get additional research experience, moving directly towards PhDs. We also do take students who are just finishing or just in the process of finishing their first degree and haven't yet enrolled for a master's. And again, all of that is fully funded and is also has additional funding streams to help with training, internships, and other opportunities. So there's a website, a lot of information on there, including testimonials from students who are currently on the program. Okay, so that really is the end of my introduction. What I'd like to now do is to move on to the two short and informative presentations that we're going to hear from. The first will be given by Dr. Liz Elvidge, who's the Associate Director for the Early Career Research Institute for Early Career Researcher Development at the Early Career Researcher Institute, the ECRI that I was talking about earlier on. And that will be followed by a presentation called Communicating with Impact, Using Positive Language to Persuade and Inform, coming from Katie Dallison, who's a careers consultant at the Imperial Careers Service. So if I can just ask Liz, please, to just make it talk. Thank you so much, Liz.
Kick off. Okay, thank you very much, Lucky, and thank you very much everyone to see you. Just to say, this is the longest job title I've ever had, so I'm so lucky you did really well to sort of get it tripping off the tongue. Before this very long job title, I used to be head of postdoc and fellows development, so I know a lot about recruitment and fellowships and things. So I'm going to give a talk about the rules of the game. Okay, next slide, please. So this is the first looking at Plan to Succeed. So the goal one is to create a strong application. So at this stage, it's a selection process, and most applications are competitive, so more than one person is applying for the vacancy. And what your purpose is to stay on the yes pile. So when people are recruiting, say we have 100 applications for 10 places, there's usually a very first sift to reject people. I know it sounds a little harsh, but that's the reality. So your job is to stay on the yes pile, and to stay in the yes pile is basically to follow the rules, and then to stay on the yes pile. So I'm going to go through some 10 tips for you about staying on the yes pile and how you do that to get to stay there. Okay, next slide, please. So these are my 10 top tips. I practice this every year. 10 top tips for a strong application. So I'm going to go through these. Some of them are very, very obvious, and I'm sorry if they seem very obvious, but it's always worth a little bit of a refresher to look at these. So it's going to be looking at time, deadlines, following the instructions, research, your achievements, adapt each application, proofreading, the 30-second rule, which I explained about, referees and references, and then seeking advice. So these are my 10 top tips. Okay, next slide, please. So the first one is about time. So it takes time to write a really, really good application, and it takes a lot longer than people realise. So when I'm supporting people who are starting out on applying for jobs or applications, I say rough rule of thumb is 1 day per application. So my advice is to break it up into small chunks of time, because to spend all day on one application in a 1 day is a little bit much, but it really does take a long time. So one of my absolute bugbears is do not ever cut and paste. And when I mean cut and paste, I mean if say you've applied for one job and then you think, oh, this is a rather good paragraph, and then you lift that paragraph and you use the same paragraph for a different job. So someone like me and the people on the panel, we can spot a cut and paste job within a couple of seconds. And it's because it's often referring to the previous job, it's referring to different criteria. Occasionally, I will get an application that addresses the application to, I really want to work for your company. So seeing as I don't work in a company, I work at a university, I know that someone has cut and pasted from a previous application. So never cut and paste, and I mean this for anything, fellowships or anything like that. Have a record of what you're applying for. So sometimes people go through a long series of applying for lots and lots of different jobs, and it's just worth having a file to remind yourself where you are with all those jobs. So be organised and schedule your time. If there's a whole number of things you're applying for, then put aside some time every day to do it. Then it won't feel quite so daunting. So the first thing is applications take a long time. You do get a little bit quicker, but they still take a long time. Okay, next slide, please. Deadlines. So I have a potential book that I'm looking at, and the title of the book is Questions I Should Never Be Asked. And one question I should never be asked is it okay if I miss a deadline? Because the answer is absolutely not. So I don't think the book's going to be a bestseller, but I think, you know, I'm going to work on it. So find out when the deadline is and check and check and check. So I've been at many committee meetings at Imperial when if the deadline is 12 midnight, is that 11:59 p.m. or is that 12 a.m.? So whichever it is, but always check. And if you are in a different country, particularly because the clocks have just changed, make sure that you know what the host country's time is, not where you are actually at that moment. Find out how and what needs submitting. So I've been caught out by this recently where we were applying for some bidding, and the day before I applied for something and the whole system crashed. And that was the day before. So always give it plenty of time. Don't leave it to the last minute because IT crashes and then it's a real scramble to sort that out and whether you have or have not submitted. And what else do you have on at that point when you're applying for things? So take your time, know when the deadlines are, and make sure that you remember to put that effort in, but schedule it within your other time. If you miss a deadline, so I've recruited for many years, if someone misses the deadline, I won't even look at it. I know that sounds brutal, but I just won't. Because normally we're in a selection process, and I know that there will be plenty of applications. So you may ask for an extension deadline, that's a different thing, but don't ever miss the deadline. And actually don't ask someone if it's okay if you miss the deadline, because if you ask me and us, the answer is most definitely no. Okay, next question. Next slide, please, sorry. Oh, okay, follow the rules. You absolutely must follow the rules. So say, for example, if the application, it says application is a maximum of 2 sides of A4 for your CV, It means 2 sides of A4. It doesn't mean your 8-page CV squeezed into 2 sides, because what you've done is you've made it into font size 7, so no one can read it, and you've taken out the margins, so people really can't read it. So absolutely follow the rules. If it says, so one thing, another question I get asked, actually, this is a second chapter in my book, is I know it says it has to be Arial, but is it okay if I use LaTeX? The answer is absolutely not. If it says you must use Arial, you must use Arial. When you get this fellowship or you get the job, you can do pretty much what you like. But at this point, this is all about staying on the yes pile. Okay, so and I know it sounds silly if it's like, well, is LaTeX that different to Arial? Yes, it is. If it says font size 11, is that really different to font size 12? Yes, it is. And because what happens is recruiters, apart from they're looking for a reason to reject you, they also think if you can't follow the rules at this point of the application stage, what will you be like as a future colleague? So that's what people think. So absolutely follow the instructions, follow the rules. Okay, next slide, please. So research. So it's for you to look at what interests you about the role. How did it fit with your short-term goals, your long-term goals? So a really common question is, where do you see yourself in 5 years' time, or where do you see yourself in 10 years' time? We once had a candidate, we asked him where he saw himself in 7 years' time, and he was absolutely flawed because he said he knew where he was going to be in 5 years' time and 10 years' time. He hadn't worked out in 7 years' time. So don't worry about that one. So do your research in what you are applying for. So what is required, what do they want, and what do they really want? So again, when you're starting out applying for jobs, you put everything on your CV and you think, oh, this makes me really stand out. But if they're asking for things that you have got, that's put those on. But ask yourself every time you put something on your CV, is this for an application? Is this what they want? So every single line, do they want to know if I've got a clean driving license? If there's no driving in the job, they don't need to know that. So again, research what the job is, what the department is, and how you fit and whether you really actually want to fit in that department. So what do you know about the institute? When I'm interviewing, one of my things that I get really frustrated about is I ask a question like, oh, what do you think about the first year course that we deliver? And if someone says, I haven't looked at it, then that's not a good candidate, because all the information is all on the internet. So if you're looking at the Imperial, we have our published strategy, our funding, our vision, our mission, we've got our values, it's all there. So do your research, and then that enables you to tailor your application to what they're looking for. Okay, next slide, please. Achievements and evidence. So as you're applying, you'll have had some great achievements, you'll have got great evidence, but you need to be asking yourself, it might be that I do have a driving license, I've got a clean driving license, but is that really important? Is that what they need? So it's an achievement, but is that really important, and is that really what they need and want? So driving license are a common thing I see, and when I see someone with a driving license on their CV, I just think it's out, they haven't updated it. So look at what makes you an ideal candidate. So what's your achievements, what you've been successful at, and then match them with what they're looking for. So use evidence and positive active words. Final thing I would say about this is no place for modesty. So write confidently and assertively, own things. So I achieved this, I led this, I implemented this. In all the years I've been doing this, I've only ever seen one application which was so over the top, which was someone who just got their PhD and they said they were a world leader in something, and 6 months, and they'd had their PhD for 6 months. So I thought that was, yeah, probably they will be in 10 years' time, but not quite yet. So, but modesty, there's no place for modesty, because again, you're needing to stay on the yes pile. And so if an applicant, if the recruiter is really having to dig through those the things you're saying because you've dumped everything in, then you're veering towards the no pile. Okay, next slide, please. Sorry, I just need to get a drink of water. So this goes back to time, really. So you need to adapt every application. Do you need to adapt every application? So a generic one. So if you write a generic application, then that will be spotted really easily. That's what I was saying earlier, is that I've had applications where they said, I want to work for your company. I've had applications where I'd really like to work for you at the University of York, which was interesting, seeing as I don't work at the University of York. And generic applications are they're just generic. So I could probably write a generic application, and the panel could, for all of you at this point. So adapt out. This is why it takes time, but adapt every application to what they are looking for. Use the job description. So there'll be a job description. So job descriptions are quite interesting. They're usually a little bit of fiction. So usually the job descriptions, the person sort of doesn't necessarily exist. So I'll give you an example, is when they say they want someone to be work independently and alone, and then to be a great team player, which sometimes is a little bit mutually exclusive. But look at the job description, highlight the keywords, and then make sure that you put in evidence of those keywords that are things that you've done. So in terms of your CV, it's not your life story. So think about things that you need to drop off your CV. At this stage, probably keeping your GCSEs possibly, A levels definitely, degree definitely, obviously. But as you progress, things will drop off your CV, and adapt it so that it makes it very easy for the recruiter. They can see this person put real effort in, that we're looking for a technician in biosciences, and then they've said my experience is X, Y, and Z in terms of biosciences, and that makes it so much easier. Okay, next slide, please. Proofreading. So proofreading is a real skill, and there's lots of software you can that you can put your things through. Some of them, they change the wording a little bit too much, so it doesn't sound like you. But proofreading, make sure your applications are the grammar's good, the spelling's good. So for me, spelling is a big thing. So the most common word I see on applications, misspelt, is the word detail. So I have an eye for detail, and it's so commonly misspelt. So my rule: 3 strikes, 3 spelling mistakes, and I go straight onto the no pile, because what I'm thinking is, if you haven't put the effort in to be careful with it, to check it, is your work sloppy? So if you haven't checked the grammar and the spelling, then what's the quality of your work? So again, 3 strikes and you're out in my book. Others might not agree, but it is a selection process. Spelling people's names is a big no. I get called Liv quite a lot, which I've no idea why, but that doesn't make me feel positive towards a candidate. And for me, thinking about women and women with titles, is calling me Mrs. Elvidge doesn't go down well either. So just a little tip, not that you'd be applying for a job with me, but just a little life tip. So get someone to proofread it, or get someone to, I think the software where your CV can be read back to you, and that's really good, because you can then see what doesn't make sense, and misspellings. So get someone to proofread it, and give them time to do that, so that what you're putting in is something of really high quality. Okay, next slide, please. 30-second rule. So I do this exercise quite a lot with people, is with groups of people. So everyone has a CV. You pass your CV on to a colleague. You time it for 30 seconds, bring the CV back, and then you ask them what stands out. And what you really want to stand out is the stuff that's really relevant for that job. What you don't want to stand out is you enjoy knitting, making cakes, and walking. Okay, so 30 seconds. It's what is really what people can see and stand out and will take home. So that's a brilliant exercise. Give it to someone who doesn't really know you. Give them your CV, count it for 30 seconds, bring it back, and say, what do you remember? So people, if your CV is longer than 2 pages, people tend to look first page, last page. And so the really significant stuff shouldn't be buried on the second page or buried at the top of the second page. So again, the first page is really significant, and make sure that the significant things is on that first page. So really good example is if you're applying for, say, a fellowship and there's no teaching, then don't put any teaching experience on that first page, because you're not going to be doing the teaching. And so what I will remember is you do teaching, but I'm not seeing the other stuff that's really relevant. But I think it's worth giving your CV to a couple of people, probably not your mums, because they'll say, oh, it's lovely, oh, you're going to get a proper job. So not your mums, but everyone else. I think colleagues is a really good idea. Okay, I can see people laughing now, so I'm going to whiz on page 9. No, sorry, top tip 9. Next slide, please. Oh yes, now this one. I wish I had £1 for every time. I really would be well off for every time I see the misuse of the word referee and reference. So referee is a person, and a reference is what that person writes. Okay, so you can say on your CV references available on request, so that's the written documents, or referees details on request. So referee, so I really do wish I had £1 for every time I see this wrong. With referees, because they're the people, have you asked them? So if you put their names and addresses on your application, your CV, most recruiters will assume you can automatically contact them. So as a courtesy, ask the people if they're willing to be a referee for you, and also give them a copy of what you send in eventually, so that they can then adapt it to what you've applied for. This sounds very, very obvious, but when you're selecting your referees, put hand on heart and ask yourself, do I know they will write me a really good reference? Because if it's someone that really doesn't know you, a head of department that doesn't know you, they will write a very generic reference, which will not do you any good. So hand on heart, do you know they'll write you a good reference? And then if you say yes, they do, then you can then ask them. So that's referees and references. Okay, next slide, please. Final one. So seek advice. So that's what this session's about. Use your connections. Use the network that Lucky and Sheen have got, and other colleagues. Ask other people a bit further on than you. So I think many of you are PGTs here. So ask people that are PGRs and PhD students. Get advice about CVs and applications. So that's definitely the Fantastic Careers Service are here to support you. And I'm going to pass on to the Fantastic Careers Service in a moment. But you're not alone. And Imperial is particularly good at supporting people in their research careers and their careers, and helping them to move along. So definitely seek advice. And I think I've got, oh yeah, next slide, please. Okay, so that's a very whistle-stop tour of my advice. So it takes time, never miss the deadlines, follow the instructions, do research, stand out with your achievements and your evidence, adapt to each application, super, super important. Proofread, so no spelling mistakes, get it checked out, 32nd rule, referees and references, and then seek advice. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Liz. Absolutely brilliant advice. I just want to add, actually, that one of the things that I know that you and your unit have done fantastically is to support the applications from postdocs for the very competitive fellowships like Future Leaders and so on, and you have a fantastic success rate. I mean, it's 70 to 100%, if I remember, depending on which year you look at.
Yeah.
And that is because you have this tremendous insight into this process, and you are generous with your information to make sure that people understand exactly what they need to do to become successful. Fantastic, fantastic, fantastic.
Yep. I would just add in terms of that is that one of these Future Leaders fellowships, we had 9 people shortlisted, and we got 8, and the one that we didn't get didn't seek any advice.
Oh, well, there you go.
Yeah.
Scientific study. There you go. Fantastic. That's brilliant. Great. So if I can now ask Katie to present, and what we're going to do at the end is actually offer the opportunity for a short Q&A. Katie can't stay for the panel session, so we're looking particularly if the audience has any particular questions for Katie, and then there's a little opportunity here to maybe get some of those answered while Katie's still with us. Okay, Katie, thank you so much.
Brilliant. Thanks, Lucky, and thanks, Liz. So I'm Katie. I'm one of the careers consultants who works in the career service. So I actually am specifically responsible for looking after postgraduate medicine. So some of you may have met me already. I've done many an induction on master's programs. But today I'm going to talk about communicating with impact, which is actually, so Liz has covered a huge amount there. I'm going to focus in a little bit more on how do you write those applications to get them noticed, because I think I've seen loads of students who are a little bit worried about standing out, a little bit worried about that competition side of things. And so, yes, it will be competitive to get these, but I think that if you can feel more confident in the way you're communicating your achievements, hopefully you're going to feel more confident in putting those applications in. So even if you think that the competition looks massive and you're very worried about getting that, you're definitely not going to get that role if you don't apply. So this is what I want to focus on today. So next slide, please. So basically, one of the key things to think about when you are applying for anything, actually, specifically PhDs in this case, is know who you're targeting. So you almost need to start thinking about these application documents, whether that's a CV or a cover letter, a CV and an application form with short answer questions, which we're seeing quite a lot of movement towards actually in the postgraduate era. But you need to think about who's going to be reading it. So Liz has helped you to think a little bit about that, but actually talking to your personal tutors or potential supervisors right now and finding out what is it that they most want to see. These documents are all going to be read by individual people. So think about who you're communicating with, and that's going to help you to tailor everything that you're talking about, because the reality is that your CV and your documents are now not about what you want to tell someone. They're very much about what that person needs to hear. So these three kind of comments that I've got here is, who are you communicating with? What do they actually need to hear? So what are they asking for? And Liz mentioned about reading the instructions. I actually used to work in the NHS, and we used to have over 3,000 applications come in per position. However, we made it relatively complicated in terms of the instructions that we gave. And one of the instructions we said was, do not put in a CV. Yet there was a space to upload a CV, which, yes, was a little mean, but we were definitely checking to make sure people could follow an instruction. And anybody who uploaded a CV, we did not shortlist. So that staying on the in pile, as Liz put it, is really important. And people will have these instructions to help you, but sometimes it's just about reading them and making sure you really understand them. And then that can then help you to think about what they need to hear. So next slide, please. One of the things Liz talked about was evidence. Now, whenever you find yourself writing some sort of statement, so for example here, this person has written a statement, I'm really interested in doing this PhD, and I think this project offers me an opportunity to learn. Okay, that's great. Those are two statements. When you find yourself writing a statement, make sure you follow it up with evidence of how you know you want to do that statement. So that evidence is usually drawn from something that you've done. Next slide, please. So when you're talking about your evidence is your experiences, no matter where they're from, and your evidence is what you've broken down that experience to be. So if you're applying for a PhD, we absolutely don't expect you to have done a PhD before. No one expects you to have done a 3 or 4 year research project. However, you will have done lots of elements that you're going to be asked to do in that PhD. So if you think about what's involved in it, and yes, there's technical things, and obviously you will know those technical things from your background. So the lab experience you might need to show, the research experience, but think about some of those other things that you're going to need. To be a good PhD student, you need to be able to collaborate, because in the future, you're going to have to win funding if you want to continue in your academic career. And the only way to win funding is generally these days to collaborate with people. You're going to need to be able to problem solve, because unfortunately research never goes right the first time. So being able to problem solve is another skill that you need to show. One of the things I think I see a lot of, especially for PhDs, is within each research experience that might come up in a CV, quite often students are really good at explaining the technical skills they've gained. You know, I can code in Python, I can do this lab experience. But actually what I also need to see is that you've got the transferable skills to be able to deal with when something goes wrong. So can you adapt your research plan or a plan? Can you problem solve? Can you collaborate? Can you work in a team and talk to people? Because you're going to have to explain your research as well. You're going to have to report on that. You're going to have to present on that. Okay, so that's where that evidence comes in. So next slide, please. When you're talking about it in a personal statement, you can draw that over. So you can see here, this person is saying, here is my evidence, and that has helped me to understand I now want to explore further. Okay, so you're actually linking things. You've done that sort of research around what they want to see. You know what you've got, and you're bringing them together. So if we go to the next slide, what you're trying to say is, how do I match this? You know, I understand what you're going to ask me to do. I understand I enjoy doing lots of parts of that. How do I join it up? And it's that positive language that you're using to say, actually, I really enjoy that. I see I can do it. Can I fit? Can I fit into this? So next slide, please. So whenever you're filling in these application forms, in no matter way, shape or form, there are 3 overarching questions that a shortlister has. And yes, there's lots of other skills you need to show them, but primarily they're really interested in seeing that you want to research in that topic. They're also really interested into why you've chosen their particular group. And I know sometimes that feels a bit weird because they might be the only ones offering that particular PhD. But what I'm actually thinking is, how will this person fit into my research group? How are they going to be as an academic researcher going forward? And then the final question of, can you do it? So whenever you're asked to apply for something, your CV is going to give me the can you do it? Okay, that's where I'm seeing all those skills. Those other 2 motivation related questions quite often come up in that personal statement. And those personal statements are quite often tricky to write. If it's not a personal statement, some PhD programs are moving towards short answer questions. And I know that Lucky's DTP one he's nodding away at me in the background. So short answer questions, which actually quite often have these questions directly in them. So it's thinking about that motivation, and that motivation is where you match, just the same way you match yourself when you're talking about the skills. I know I can do this, I've done it here. I know I'm interested in it because I've done it here. Okay, next slide, please. So we've got extra support for you at the Careers Service, and I would definitely recommend checking it out. Now, lots of people overlook this idea of reflection. When you get to a PhD interview, you're going to have to talk about your motivation. You're going to have to explain why you want to do it. You're going to have to tell me why you like research. Which seems like a very basic question, but it's one of the first questions that I always ask people when they come to me and they say, I'm not sure if I should do a PhD or not. I'm like, well, do you like research? And if you can't answer that question, then probably committing yourself to 3 to 4 years of further research is not going to be such a good idea. So you might want to go back and think about, well, how do I figure out if I like research? And these 2 little videos, which are attached to web pages with more content, can help you just to think about that. You know, what is my motivation for doing this? And then when you're getting to the more hard and fast evidence details. What are the skills I've gained from doing various different research projects? We are all aware that you've probably just started your master's and you're going to do more research throughout this year. So this idea of applying a year in advance. Don't panic. That's exactly what recruiters are used to seeing. And so you're drawing on experiences from the past, but you might mention that you're looking forward to doing more research in this area going forward. Next slide, please. Another web page we've got, so I know there'll be lots of people asking questions about support and further study. So we've got this web page that you can have a look at, and I know Nishine's going to share the slides at some point, so you'll have all those links. And final slide, please. Oh, sorry, maybe not my final slide. This is how you book to see us if you haven't managed to access the careers service yet. So again, it's a very simple process, and your single sign-in will get you into everything. Next slide, please. And if you need extra support, but you haven't had a chance to talk to the careers service yet, there is a specific postgraduate course called Attributes and Aspirations. It's aimed at masters. It's got persona within it that are applying for PhDs and that aren't applying for PhDs. You can see some really good examples of CVs, and so all of that content is up there, so you can access that one 24/7. The careers service is only open weekdays between 10 and 5, so this one is for every time. And I think that is my final slide, or last slide.
Katie, thank you so much. That's fantastic. And I can really recommend Attributes and Aspirations because it's a compulsory component of the way that we're training our PhD students on our MRC DTP programs. So fantastic. So we got a few minutes before we take a break. Nishine, have we got any questions come in? If not, I have a couple of questions that maybe Katie can help us with.
Yeah. Cool. I can't see any questions in the Q&A, Lucky.
Okay.
Yeah. So yeah.
Sorry. So there's a couple of questions which I have got, which have come from students previously. One is really, what is the best approach for the type of question which is tell me about yourself, or indeed what are your strengths and weaknesses?
Yes, absolutely. So tell me about yourself. I find a really lazy question. I think lots of recruiters use it because they think it's going to help to relax you and get you talking. But for me, I find if they ask me that's my first question, it's sort of like makes you all a bit nervous. What I would suggest preparing in advance of going into any interview actually is the 3 top things you want that recruiter to remember about you. So this is whether you're doing a PhD or whether you're moving into industry, whatever. Think about the 3 things you want that recruiter to know about you when you leave. And think about how you know those things. So these can be overarching things like I'm I come from a multinational background and I find that really interesting when I'm researching because I can do this, this, and this. But if you've got those 3 top things, when someone asks you, tell me about yourself, you can then say, actually, here are the 3 things I really want you to remember about me. It also works because sometimes at the end of an interview, I will say to people, is there anything else you want to tell me? And so then you can fall back on those 3 things and go, oh, actually, there were 3 things I want you to remember about me. They are this, this, and this. I've told you about all of them, so that's great. Or can I tell you a bit more about this one? So I would say that tell me about yourself, if you take charge of it and actually have those 3 ideas. In terms of strengths and weaknesses, nobody wants to talk about their weaknesses in an interview. It always seems a bit sad. However, what is that recruiter really asking? They're not bothered about your greatest weakness, which is another word into play. What they're really asking is, are you aware of where you're going to need some development? Okay. And what are you doing to help solve that? So I once interviewed for a project management role, so a person who wanted to be a project manager, and they told me that their weakness was time management. And I'm sitting there thinking, that's not ideal for a project management role. But then they went on to explain to me all the things they were doing to make sure that they had that good time management, and that's what I'm looking for basically is what is your reflection and what are you doing to fix it?
Brilliant. Okay. Something on there. Okay, so I think we're ready. Just to thank both Katie and Liz for those very insightful, very useful talks. So it's now 10 to 2. So let's reconvene at 2 o'clock and make a start with the Q&A session with the panel. Okay, thank you, everybody. It's 2 o'clock now, so we can make a start with the panel. So you have in the program for today the biographies for the members of the panel. So all I'm going to do is really now just ask each of the panel members just a wave so that we know who's who. So you know myself, I'm Lucky. Kevin, if you can give us a quick wave. Just to say hi. Great. Angela. Thank you. Liz, who you've heard from, so you do know. Liz, please wave. Myra. There you go. Thanks so much, Myra. And Jeffrey. Great. Thank you so much. So now we've got everybody identified. So we're going to answer the questions in 3 parts, which is preparing your application, writing an effective application, and delivering a good interview. So that follows on, I think, fairly well from the presentations that we just had. So we had some questions fielded in advance. So when you registered for this webinar, there was an opportunity to ask some questions. I'm going to start going into those, and then we'll go into the Q&A, so they're beginning to come in now. So we would encourage you to ask questions, particularly initially focused on preparing your application, and then we're moving into those other areas. That would be helpful. So if I could just start with a question that came in, and Kevin, if it's okay, I'd ask you just to lead on this, which is how do you go about applying for funds and grants for a project that you might be interested in? So we're now talking that from both the student's point of view, and I suppose trying to engage with a supervisor to see if they can get funding for you.
Okay, I guess it's quite a big question. I guess it depends. Some people have a very specific idea about what they want to work on or the area they're particularly interested in. And I would suggest a good first move around that is to try and find the investigators at the institutions you might be interested in applying to across the country who are working on that, and maybe sending kind of short speculative emails to them about it, that you're interested in their work, asking if they have any PhD opportunities or research opportunities, or if they know of any which would allow you perhaps to work with them, etc., etc. And that can start off a dialogue that way. I think for people who have broader interests, you can do that as well. But if you know you want to do a neuroscience or a life sciences PhD, or you may be interested in the microbiome, but you're not sure what, then it may be that more kind of looking at some of the more centralized programs across institutions is helpful from that point of view, like the MRC DTP here or BBSRC equivalents, and checking for those that have kind of taking students that work in those more general areas, I guess. So I could talk more about that, but I guess it's if I hand over to some others who can maybe give a bit more detail.
Sure. Maybe I can also just add a little bit more of a thread here as well, a side thread, which is that for some of the headline scholarship applications, such as the President's, and then we've got other things like the China Scholarship Scheme and so on, they are dependent on the student applying with a supervisor. So there are opportunities that arise at Imperial and other institutions where you can engage with a supervisor and then seek kind of funding together in that sense.
Yeah, so again, those kind of approaches to supervisors, talking about the area, and I guess the things to think about for that is, I get a lot of emails like that where people have obviously sent it to hundreds of people. It's not very personalized. They obviously don't really know what I work on or whatever. And so exactly you really do need to want to work with these people, and that makes your email a lot more convincing. You might want to mention a little bit about what they're doing, what particularly interests you. And I guess also, don't think because there's a PhD deadline next week that if you email somebody today that you're going to be able to put something together in time for that. It's usually, if somebody does want to work with you, they usually want to chat to you, consider working with you. They're going to chat to you first, usually meet you. but then you can't do this sort of thing overnight as well. So make sure that there's time before the deadlines when you're approaching people.
Sure. Do any of the panel want to add to that in terms of advice, schemes they might know of? Okay. All right. There was a question, I think, Jeffrey, you could help us with. Oh, just to say as well, actually, the program that we've issued has lots of links to advice on getting funding and scholarship opportunities and so on. So definitely students on the call, on the webinar, should refer to some of those links as well. Jeffrey, a question which has come up, which is, can you get a scholarship alongside a PhD stipend? So I guess if you've got a stipend, is it possible to get additional funding from other sources? I think it's probably the way that question's going.
I don't see why not. I don't think there'd be a rule against that.
No.
I suppose the question would be why you were seeking that, and would that be linked also to a statement about the research and whether you could make a convincing case for it. But you know, sometimes you might have a scholarship that covers, you know, research, but you need to get money for consumables or something like that. And in those situations, if you're not already in touch with a supervisor, then I think it would be, you know, best to talk to somebody who is used to that arrangement where students come with part funding and then they need to raise the money to cover the whole cost of their studies. Sure.
There are out there fees only scholarships. You know, we have some. There's some available through other agencies and organisations, and obviously, you know, you then need to try and get funding for stipend. Ideally, I mean, that's one example of where you're going to be potentially holding more than one scholarship at a time. College also offers a few scholarship schemes based on funding accommodation, purely on accommodation. So again, those can be held by students that have also got stipends coming in from somewhere else. Anyone else got any experience in that? They want to add to that question? Angela.
I think it's just really important if you're applying for scholarships that you know the terms and conditions, particularly if you're applying for a government scholarship from another country, because frequently they have very specific terms attached to them. And that may be that you are restricted to the amount of hours you're allowed to work, for example, or what you're allowed to apply for in combination with the funding that they are offering you. So sometimes we have students who are applying for multiple things and they say, if I get this one, I can't then take this one, but if I get this one, then I can. So it is, I think, important to read the fine print in those cases.
Absolutely. And actually, even with the Home Research Council funded scholarships and DTP offerings, they do come with a limit on the amount of time you can work, the number of hours you can. It's usually phrased as number of hours, so it's actually not even anticipating there might be a tax implication because you've earned so much you have to end up paying tax, but they are actually phrased in terms of our numbers of hours. So again, if you are a student applying and it's very difficult, even on a regular stipend to live in London, and you're going to need to work to supplement that income, there will be limits on the amount of hours that you can work without impinging on your stipend, the offer of your stipend. Okay, so we've got a few questions coming in on the chat. This one is, how important are those preliminary emails first expressing interest in a PhD? How much information should you include? Okay, anybody on the panel want to kick off on that one? Jeffrey.
I expect several of us will have views on this. My advice always to students who are sending speculative inquiries to a potential supervisor is to make that first email quite hardworking. So you need to get their attention with the subject line, address them by the right name, write quite I would say, a brief hardworking paragraph saying why you're writing to them, what your interests are, and make it clear that you know what that lab is working on. You know, And one formula you can use, if you're very serious about this, is to say, I would like to work with you because I've seen, I looked at PubMed and I saw what you published last year, and this field of, let's say, microbiome, that's a word that's come up before, is something I would like to work with you in your lab. And, you can attach a CV and bear in mind all of those rules about CV that Liz was telling you about earlier. So you want to make that initial contact brief and hardworking and give them enough information to decide whether they are interested in working with you or not. So that'd be my top tip.
Thank you so much. Anybody else want to add to that?
I
Myra.
really just want to reiterate what Liz has said, because there's nothing more irritating than getting a letter from someone where they haven't spelled your name correctly, or they've mentioned some work that you did 20 years ago and you don't do it anymore. So you've got to have some sort of common sense.
Angela?
I think also to reiterate what Liz said earlier, please don't copy and paste. Not 2 hours ago, just before this, I received an email that had, "Dear Dr. Kedgley, blah, 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 blah." And then in the same email, "Dear so-and-so, who wasn't me, blah, 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 blah," because somebody was clearly pressing Control-C, Control-V. Happens all the time. And also be specific, because anytime I get an email that says, "I would be very interested in working with you at your university in your lab," I immediately go, well, you have no idea what it is that I do. And I have no indication as to why you would want to come and work here. So it has to be specific.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Kevin?
Yeah, I would just also say that I know letter writing is a slightly lost art, and I don't think there's an awful lot of training on how to address people. And I'm fairly easygoing with this stuff, but I do often get stuff where people look like they're just posting it on Twitter to me. So there's a kind of, "Hi, love this, da 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 da. Can you get back to me at," or whatever. And I would say that a slightly more formal approach, you bear in mind you don't know anything about the person usually that you're writing to and what they expect. And I guess showing a bit of professionalism would be, "Dear Dr. such and such, dear Professor, looking forward to hearing from you," etc. So do think about that. If you're worried about it, you can always draft it and ask somebody else to look at the email first as well. And I think that's probably a pretty good idea.
Yeah.
My other top tip is, so I think you need to be specific to show you're actually interested in the area and what they do. I often do get students who approach me who actually have an incredibly specific idea about what they want to do for their PhD, and they would like me to host that. And they've detailed experiments that would cost me £4 million to run for their PhD, for example. So you also have to bear in mind that this coming together, it's not just about somebody is going to set you up in a lab and throw money at you to do exactly what you want to do. What you're looking for is a balance where your interests overlap with the interests of the host lab in that way. So maybe not just dictating, "I demand to, this is what I'm going to do. Can you help me out?" So it's a bit of a balance there.
Yeah. Liz?
Yeah, just say I agree with everything what's said. Again, if we all receive so many of these, my tip is it's just one screen, so people's not having to scroll. The formal bit's really important. So when I get an email that says "hire," I'm like, nope, delete. And white space is your friend. So actually space it. So I did get an email once where they were so confused they covered all bases. So I was Professor, Mr., Miss, Dr. Elvidge, and I was like, well, you covered all bases, but I think you should have, sorted it out. But I agree with what everyone else has said, but it's just tailor it and specific and do your research.
Brilliant. Angela?
Please attach your CV.
When you say I've got your CV.
Because genuinely what you're doing is you're saving me an email, because if what I think you've written is excellent, the first thing I want to reply and say is, "Please send me your CV and your transcript." So skip that step, just attach them.
Sure. I'm going to be a bit controversial here. I got sent something recently by a student which included their CV, and the personal statement had a watermark on it, which was ChatGPT. So they hadn't actually edited that. Now, I don't know if it's a bad thing or a good thing that students are using something like ChatGPT, just to polish things up. We don't really have any hard and fast rules about this. I don't know if anyone's wants to comment on that. I mean, it actually read very nicely. If ChatGPT wants to do a PhD with me, then I'm happy to try and facilitate that. Anyone here feel strongly about that kind of use of? Oh, lots of hands. I'm sorry. Okay.
Angela, you go first.
I think it's a tool. I think it's a tool that we have to work with, and it's something that's available to you, and it's something that is out there, and it will be available if you have a job somewhere. But it is a tool, and if I say this in my classes as well, if you submit something that you have used some kind of augmented computerized tool to create, you need to accept responsibility for what that is and what is being sent. So if you're going to use it, proofread it, make sure it says what you think it's going to say, and then be aware of the fact that if you don't do that and it says something funny, it's on you.
Absolutely. Jeffrey.
I mean, what I would say is that ChatGPT is not intelligent, whereas you, the applicant, are. And, if I won't know if you have used ChatGPT, and I won't know if you've used it in an intelligent way by then looking at the output and thinking, does this actually express what I want to say? But let's say you got away with that, and then, you got an interview, or you even got the post. At some point, it's going to become clear that you're not the author of that initial contact or of that CV. And I think you do want to think about expressing yourself and your personality and your scientific interests. And if already at this stage you're reaching for electronic aids to do that, I think that's a habit you'd like to get out of. And I do encourage students to produce things that express what they are like and that breathe their personality.
Brilliant. A question which I think should be relatively simple to answer, and that's come up in the Q&A, which is, should you still include A-level results on a CV after achieving a master's? How relevant are they? Now, some application processes specifically ask for your results from a certain time point, so they may already exclude them. Is it important for us to see A-level results at all when making decisions? Liz?
I think it depends. I think by masters, A-levels are relatively, well, actually, no, they're 4 years away, aren't they? 4 years old.
Yeah.
I think it depends it depends what they show. So if you've got 6 A-levels at A-star, probably yes. But if you've got 4 A-levels at C's at different subjects, and you've sort of managed to move out and do really well, I'm not sure that's a good thing. So, but if it says on the form, include your A-levels, then do what it says on the tin. So that would be my advice. But when you've got a PhD, chuck your A-levels, unless you've got like 10 A-stars, and then maybe keep them on. But you have to get rid of them at some point.
That's right. Jeffrey?
I would add to that a point that's been made earlier about white space and, emphasizing what's important. If your A-levels are taking up space, which you could have used to tell me what the title of your final year undergraduate project was, which is something I'd be much more interested in, don't put the A-levels in. So, the 2-page rule for your CV, if the A-levels are coming at the expense of something else that I would rather see, then don't put them in.
Okay. Brilliant. Okay, there's a question that was sent in advance, but actually has also come up in the chat. A very similar question. Maybe Angela, you could help by initiating a response to this, which is, how easy is it to switch to another biomedical science discipline for a PhD? For example, you did a BSc and MSc, say, in pharmacology and immunology, and you want to do a PhD in neuroscience. Are you at a disadvantage when applying, and will it be more work during the PhD to achieve the base level of understanding? So there's several layers to this question. It's really about changing fields into the PhD. Any comments and advice on that, Angela?
I mean, my personal feeling is that everything is possible, but I maybe come from a background where that is changing fields does not mean the end of your career, but it does mean you have to put in the time to make sure you have the basics. And certainly so I'm in the Department of Bioengineering, and we frequently see people coming from other engineering departments into bioengineering. And we often say to people, it's good practice to maybe do a 1-year master's to get all the basics, so that when you start your PhD, you can hit the ground running because you've done the basics of the taught courses. And yes, maybe that does mean an additional year, but it depends how big the jump is, because if the jump is not so large and you know how to do the reading and you know how to do the learning, then it might not take very long to catch up. If the jump is larger, it may be better in the long term to take the year, get the basics, and then do the PhD. That's my thought.
Good. Yeah, I agree with everything you say. You say that. In fact, I think we almost have a term for this now, which is like non-linear PhD careers, isn't it? Where you're coming in from some other career background and then you're swapping over into in our case it'd be more sort of biological research, but it doesn't have to be. And that's becoming more and more common. And actually, the funding agencies are aware of this as well. I think they're beginning to want to encourage this kind of thing, which is a very good thing to see, actually. I don't know if
sorry, Lucky, I think one other thing. I think sometimes students get very concerned that they're losing time and they're taking too much time and there's a rush to get through everything. But I think it's important to remember that the prior learning is not lost. And it's not that you are losing something by doing an additional year. It's gaining the additional preparation that's going to set you up the best to succeed in the next thing you want to do.
Sure. Anybody else on the panel want to chip in? Myra?
Yes, Lucky. I've had a few people in my lab who came from mathematics or, different disciplines, and it's never proved a problem, and they've been willing to put in the work, and it brought a new perspective to the lab too. They became quite helpful contributors, So I don't see it as a problem. I mean, personally, I changed field every time I did a thesis, so I don't think it matters at all.
Yeah, that's true. It doesn't matter. I mean, I change fields as well, I have to say. Jeffrey?
I worry perhaps less than Angela does, but then Angela's working in bioengineering and I've not worked in an engineering type discipline. But I moved from astronomy to crystallography to embryology to neuroscience. So I've jumped around a lot, but always there was a boundary, between the things I was going from and to. There was a blurring that I could make the connection or the leap between the thing I was doing and the thing I want to do next. And particularly in biomedicine, a lot of the disciplines merge at their boundaries. So, if your first degree or your master's degree was immunology, there are applications of immunology in all kinds of other topics, including molecular biology, neuroscience, and so on. So I think the main thing that's going to drive you through your PhD is how fascinated you are by the research.
Yeah.
And I would say that's the thing that often strikes a potential supervisor. Yes, this person's really keen, and even though they haven't got the ideal preparation, perhaps, I think they'll be carried through just by drive.
Yeah.
I think the particular question I read, and there was, as I say, a related question in the chat, refers to having started in a background in immunology and then wanting to do a PhD in neuroscience. Well, now, for 5 years ago, they would almost have been seeing as different things. But of course, now the big hot topic in neuroscience is inflammation, and so people will be jumping at you if you actually knew what anything about immunology in the context of neuroscience. So actually, as you say, as fields develop, new skills become really important and come to the fore. That's good. Okay. Have we got any more questions in the chat, Nisheen? I'm only looking at the ranked ones at the moment, so maybe I'm looking at the wrong thing. So I'm going to the recent posts.
So there are questions in the
sorry, Nisheen, I can't hear you, I don't think. You're very muffled.
Hear me now, Lucky?
No, I can't hear you.
Can you hear me now, Lucky?
Yeah, now we're good. Yeah.
Sorry about that. So there are questions in the Q&A in the published section, and we're responding from an admin perspective. But if you could pick these up with the panel, there are a couple of questions around when you're applying, and if you have done the work in terms of speaking to previous students, should that be mentioned? How to mention it? Should we say what we learned from their advice? That kind of thing.
So are these showing up in the rank questions, is it? Or no?
Yes, it should be from the first post downwards in the Q&A section.
Yeah, I've got them in the okay. If you look at them as
would you like me to read out
posts.
one or two of the questions?
Yeah, if you read out a couple of them, because when I go to the rank by vote, it only shows two or three questions, which we've already covered.
Okay,
yeah,
so here's a question for the panel. Following up question from reaching out to older students and mentioning their feedback on the personal statement, how should this be done? Should we mention what they said and why it caught our interest, or what we learned from their advice?
Okay, anybody want to pick up on that?
Do we think this is, sorry, Angela.
No, go ahead.
Is this a question from someone who is returning to do a PhD after perhaps having had a break, going into work, something of that sort? Because that's getting increasingly common, and we do see applicants who've done other things and want to come back into research, and that by itself isn't a problem. No one's going to say, well, you're not 22 and straight out of a master's degree, so we're not interested. So that's how I interpret that question.
Okay.
I think the question had to do with if they've spoken with people in their research group, how do they then include that in their communications? And should they? I think that was what it was about, maybe. Nishina, can you confirm or deny?
Yeah, no,
that's my understanding.
Yeah.
Okay.
I would say not really, because if you're doing your work, you'll be getting advice for a number of people. So I would use the information that they give you on terms of the research, the science, etc. But I probably wouldn't pay much heed to someone being named, to be honest.
I'm not sure that I wouldn't resent it, actually, that they talk to the lab before they've talked to me. I'm not so sure it's such a great idea to bring that up. It can come up in conversation, but if you're approaching somebody, I don't think you want to say, I've been chatting to your lab and there's good and bad, and I'd quite like to investigate coming to work with you.
Liz, you got your hand up again.
I agree with Myra. I think do background work and find out things, but I think there's a fine line between that and it just being a little bit creepy. So years ago I was on an interview panel, and someone was doing a presentation about how they would work with physics PhD students, and they'd found a picture of me and then they cut and paste my head onto someone else's body.
Oh dear.
And that was really what really annoyed me was they didn't put it on a taller, thinner body. They just and that was really creepy. So I just think sometimes just stay this side of normal. So it's like when you've had an interview, don't email the interview panel. When you're applying for a job, don't sort of then randomly connect on LinkedIn, things like that. So just do background work, find out. But I absolutely do agree with Mara. I'm not sure I'd like someone to be saying, oh, by the way, I was talking to all your colleagues and this is what they said. I think that would that wouldn't be appealing.
Kevin.
I guess on the other side, I have had people who have ended up working with ex-students or postdocs of mine at another institute, or maybe being taught by them, and they might have asked their advice about going on to PhDs and particular fields, etc., and sometimes my name has been mentioned or whatever. I had a couple of people like that, and then that seems, it's just a story about how you've come to talk to me, essentially, and it feels a little bit less invasive. I mean, I would also say that most PhD supervisors, I think, or at least if somebody is thinking about coming to work with me, I say, look, to get an idea of how we work and what the lab runs like, I'll give you the email addresses of a couple of students or postdocs at that point, and I'm sure they're happy to have a chat with you or something like that. So that maybe works at a later stage.
Angela.
I guess the other thing to remember is that your application and your communication should be about you. And therefore, it's not necessarily about what other people have said. It's about what you want to do, and why you're a good fit, not whether someone else is telling you that this is going to work for you.
Okay, I think we should be ready to move on next to the next part. But just before we do that, there is one question that's come up in the chat, which actually, Liz, I think you'd be interested in answering. It's actually about, the question is about following up a question from reaching out to older students and using them as a source for feedback of applications and personal statements. Actually, we could extend that further to postdocs, because you've done a lot of work trying to get postdocs to help students in making applications and so on. Did you want to just comment on that? How effective that works? How
yeah, I mean,
I
think it's really important to get feedback. Sometimes I see that people they ask too many people to get for feedback, and so then the person's completely confused, because at some point the feedback will be contradicting other feedback. But I think, yes, get feedback from peers and someone who's maybe a little bit further on. But the key thing about feedback is that it is a gift, but it's not one that you necessarily need to take. Because the end result of what you put in your application, your CV, and when we're preparing mock interviews and things, it has to be you. So it has to be you on that piece of paper, you at the mock interview, rather than so-and-so said this, and I think I need to be saying this or writing that. So definitely get feedback, but just, yeah, get feedback, but be prepared. Sometimes it just contradicts, people contradict each other, and then it gets a bit stressful.
Thank you so much. So I'd like to move on
again. Can I?
Yes.
Could I ask one quick question? Well, I know you're trying to move on, might be running out of time, but it's an interesting one. I'm not sure how to answer it. Does a PhD from a research institute hold the same value as a PhD from a university?
Okay, so research institutes generally don't have the power to award directly, so they will be associated with a university. So here, the LMS, it's Imperial. At other MRC institutions, it will be different awarding bodies. There was a period of time when the MRC Laboratory of Molecular Biology, which has the highest density of Nobel Prizes anywhere on the planet, actually was awarding its PhDs through the Open University, because they had a bit of a spat with Cambridge. So, basically you need an awarding body, and it will be awarded through them. But you will always it'll always be clear that where you did your research, and then who is the awarding body from the nature of the award. Okay. If we could, we're just about to move on to the second part, which is writing an effective application. And just one more quick thing, Indica, there's in the chat, there's a specific question about the MRC DTP and international students and fees. Maybe Indica, you could reply directly to that.
Yeah,
Indica
we responded to that one.
Oh, fantastic! Thank you so much. Great, good. All right, so now we're going to move on to the topic area of writing an effective application. So if any of you have already put in Q&A questions for those, then which hopefully we'll pick them up. Otherwise, please feel free to ask us questions in that area. We've had some questions already in advance. Okay, so there's a question that was sent in advance. Yeah, okay, so here's one that maybe Angela and Kevin can help us kick off with, which is, for students applying for PhD programs, what skills are most valued in a strong candidate beyond academic performance? If someone doesn't have much experience outside of university, such as internships or related jobs, how can they still present themselves as a competitive applicant? So quite a complex question there, but maybe you could begin to address that, perhaps.
So I guess what I really like in PhD students are people who can do stuff and can solve problems, And I would, in a perfect world, you would also have the research experience and experience in some of the techniques and the fields that I'm looking for. But I guess if you don't have that, which I think, to be fair, is always going to make you a bit less competitive compared with somebody who does, then somebody who can own a problem, who can tell me about things that they've done, that they've organized themselves, who can get across how good they are at dealing with problems that come up, that they're solving stuff, that kind of thing, I think is helpful. And I think there are lots of opportunities for people to show that. Some of that might be other undergraduate activities you've got in, societies you've been involved with, events you might have organized, and that kind of thing. As I say, in a perfect world, I would like to see some practical experience as well where I can, though I think we are also relatively more understanding that there's fewer opportunities at undergrad that there once were. And obviously, we've also dealt with a kind of COVID generation who had much less opportunity to get in the laboratory as well from that point of view. I don't know what Angela thinks.
So I completely agree. I think one of the things that Kevin was kind of skirting around is tenacity is a big thing in research. And if you can prove that you are determined and you can tackle problems and multitask, those are very valuable traits in a research environment. And I think you can prove that without necessarily having perfectly relevant experience. If you've had a job because you've been working alongside your undergraduate degree and you've done really well at both, that demonstrates that you're able to manage different situations at the same time. That's a valuable skill. And so it doesn't necessarily have to mean that you've done the exact same thing that you're planning to do your PhD in, but the ability to pick up new skill sets, the ability to multitask, and the ability to persevere when things are not going to plan are very valuable.
Jeffrey.
And if you worry that you don't have a lot of experience, and you've made that point Angela's talking about tenacity and setbacks, one thing that can get you some extra points, I think, is to show that you've got a realistic idea of what it's going to be like doing research. So, do you understand the difficulties of this subject, or do you understand what the frontier questions are that are being asked in the lab, and do you know what experimental approaches they're using? Because, if it's clear to you, well, if it's clear from reading what they do, that it's a completely dry lab using bioinformatics, you wouldn't make an application talking a lot about, cutting up tissue and culturing slices and things like that. So showing an awareness of the environment. And I have a word of advice for students who have done a lot of experience and they've worked in different institutes and they've been to conferences, they may have even published a small paper. For goodness sake, don't assume that will just carry you through. I see too many applications from students who seem to have been everywhere, done everything. They can name drop all of these, famous people on their forms, but they don't seem to actually have learned something from that. So if you do think you've got lots of experience, make sure you leverage it when you're writing your application, and don't assume that we're just going to fall over and be impressed just because you've got this apparently very developed CV.
I know students do worry about not having any experience, but there's something to be said for taking a raw virgin student who has no experience, because sometimes they just learn bad habits in someone else's lab. So I wouldn't worry about it too much. It's much more, what's the word I'm looking for? Powerful for us as interviewers if your application has been written in accordance with the advice that Liz has just given you. If I may say, just in case the audience think that this is esoteric advice, when I've sat, Lucky knows I've sat on interview panels from medical students to chairs, hundreds, if not thousands of them. And the advice that Liz gave you in her first lecture this afternoon is exactly the advice you would give anyone at any stage of their career. So if I were you, I would master this advice now at the early stage of your career, keep the slides and refer to them each time you're applying for something. I think if you follow that advice, you won't go wrong at interview, frankly. That's all I have to say.
Yeah, we should have given that advice maybe to Kamala Harris. Huh? You're gonna
maybe
make
not.
maybe not. Yeah. Okay. So there's a question in the chat, and we've had a kind of related question as a pre-question, and I think it comes down to how do you actually best demonstrate enthusiasm when you're making an application, and particularly if that enthusiasm is in the context of, again, of a lack of experience when applying for a particular master's or a PhD. Any advice on that?
Not to be hysterical. There is nothing worse than somebody jumping up and down and saying how much they want to work with you and how much they want to do this. You've got to be, you know, a little stable and a little measured about it all. People will know if you're interested, if you've been interested enough to do your background work, if you look sincere. I mean, we're quite perceptive in our way when we interview you, but certainly not the grand drama of how much you want to work there.
Sure.
Very off-putting.
Liz.
So I was going to say exactly the same. So we don't want, as this is a phrase I think from Yorkshire, we don't want any giddy kippers. Okay, so no giddy kippers. Okay, and if you've got a CV and you've got a cover letter, your CV should be factual, very easily accessible. Your cover letter is the opportunity to show a bit of personality, but I would say no exclamation marks. I'm very guilty of that in my emails, but that's different. No exclamation marks. Show your enthusiasm. But yes, absolutely agree with what Mara says. Is, you know, just don't get sort of all giddy about it. So so can I just say there's a question here about a CV. Can I pick this one up? So it says in the CV, if we already satisfy the basic requirements, could we mention skills and experiences not directly related? So some golden rules about CVs. And I'm just going to very, very terrible plug the second edition of my book, which is, can you see it? Can you see it?
No.
Yeah.
We can see it now. Yeah.
And it's got a chapter on CVs. So available from good bookshops or the library. Anyway, so in terms of CVs, it's you on a piece of paper, and you need to be really proud of what's on that piece of paper. So what I say to people is every single line, and Jeffrey actually brought this up about if your A levels are taking up more space, that some more useful stuff could be, then you take it out. But every single line, and you have to be ruthless and do it with someone else to go through. So look at every single line and ask them, why am I telling them this? So if the top of your CV says CV, why are you telling them that this is a CV when it's very obviously a CV? So take that line out. If you feel that you need to put your address on your CV, you don't. And the reason I say that is that people make judgments about where people live. And there was a neat piece of research that said that if it's gender specific. So if someone looks at CV, if a woman is applying for a job in London and they live in Edinburgh, unconsciously the bias is that they won't move. So you don't need that. You don't need that layer of judgment going on. So every single line, ask them, what, you know, is this relevant? Why am I telling them this? And as you progress in your career, sometimes I see CVs that are covered with other people's names. And what the people look at is think that's reflected glory. So I was in Professor McClure's lab, I was in Professor Cageley's lab, etc., etc., etc. And I'm saying, why are you giving someone else space on your CV when they could be referees, writing references? And so it's quite a hard task, but it is literally every single line. Why am I telling them this? Does make me stand out? If there's no teaching in this job, even though I'm really good at teaching, do I need to tell them about teaching? Now it could be you can change that a little bit, so that it's not, you know, I teach first year undergraduates, but it is about skills development with students, things like that. So it's a really good task to do, but just do it with someone else. Why am I telling them this? And if you can't answer the question, take it out.
Jeffrey.
And that point about sticking to the question, that also matters if you are doing a personal statement or if you're doing the short answers. So increasingly, institutes, and Lachy talked about this earlier, are asking you situational judgment questions. So if you were in this situation, what would you do? In a team of people, what role would you take? The way to answer that is not to say, when I was in the lab of Nobel Prize winning Professor XYZ, because immediately that throws up the suspicion that you're just trying to steal a march on other candidates by bragging about all the important places you've worked in. You know, that question's there for a reason. It's trying to find out whether you have the sorts of, whether you're already thinking of yourself as a research scientist in this situation, and whether you can reflect on what your strengths and weaknesses are. So follow the rubric, and unless somebody asks you, tell me what important people you've worked for, then probably don't put that in.
Thank you so much. There's a question in the chat I just wanted to just address very quickly. It's coming from a clinician who's interested in if lab experience that's been experienced through an undergraduate degree is going to be sufficient to help them apply for specific PhDs, presumably in that related expertise. So generally speaking, yes, it would. But actually, we have a clinical academic training office called Cato at Imperial. It's worth looking at the both their website and the information they give out, and they're actually very willing to help as well in dialogue. They have a lot of guidance and information of how clinicians should best approach doing PhDs, where to get these opportunities and what sort of things you need to have in place. And they will even help with things like mock interviews. And again, you know, these would be sort of clinical based interviews as well. So Cato is the place to go to for that question. Okay, now then there was a question here. If our application got denied or failed, can we email supervisors asking for feedback on our application in order to improve? If I could just kick this off before just asking the panel generally, for our doctoral training program, and by ours, that's myself, Angela, and Kevin, we will get in excess of 300 applications a year. And what happens is that those get filtered down into a long list of 80 to 90, which are then subsequently sent out internally within the college so that they're scored by multiple scorers. It's 3. And then we use those scores and the comments to then draw up a short list for interview. So that short list of interviews whittle down to about 25 students to interview. So you can see it's a reductive process. So if a student is actually doesn't make it through into the long list, we can only really provide very little in the way of feedback, and we try to do so, but it's really rather high level. And then what happens is that if they're then rejected as a result of the shortlisting and interview, we are in a position to provide some more possibly what we would call useful feedback, both in terms of their application and their interview. So generally speaking, programs will offer you feedback, but depending on where you have come out of the system, that feedback can be quite detailed or actually relatively generic in its formulation. Okay, so maybe I can just refer back to the panel. Giving feedback, how does that work? Liz?
Yeah, so I think for me it depends where they are in the process. So if someone's not shortlisted, I just don't have the resource to give feedback. I wouldn't, particularly when you get loads and loads of applications. So generally I wouldn't. I think if someone had been interviewed, I wouldn't volunteer to give them feedback, but if they asked for feedback, I would give them feedback. And the question, and I think I've said this at this session before, which startles people, but the question to ask is, rather than can you just give me some feedback, because then a panel could say there were lots of really good candidates, you know, we enjoyed meeting with you, so quite high level and general level, is to ask the question, what would I have needed to have done to have been offered this job? Now that's you can't wriggle out of that question, and so that's what I always encourage people to say, is go back and say, rather than asking feedback, say, what would I need to have done to have been offered this job? And then it's actually, in some ways, it's easier then to give feedback. Well, we were looking for someone with a lot more admin experience, or etc. etc. So that's what I always say. What would I need to have done?
Anyone else want to just chip in on that, reinforce that?
I've never been asked this question, but I would look sympathetically at it if I was asked it. If somebody said, what was my weakest point? If we were talking about the interview, for example. And again, it might be that there were no particular weak points, but we had, we interviewed 12 people and we had 6 places, and, we had to make a judgment. But it is easier to answer a direct question. In the same way, when you're writing to a lab you want to work in, instead of saying, I'm really fascinated by the microbiome, you might, particularly if the lab are working on this, say, I'm interested in whether endometabolites go through the blood-brain barrier. Show them that you have some specific interest. And in the same way, if you're requesting feedback, do a bit of self-analysis first. You may suspect where it was you went wrong. You might say, well, when I gave this answer, was that the thing that, tipped the balance? So do help the feedbacker by giving them a question they can answer.
Okay, so that now we're already talking about the interview. So that's the last part, the last section. So we're going to just round things off by talking, having some discussions around some questions about delivering a good interview. So again, Q&A, if you've got any questions specifically about interviews, we'd be happy to look at them for you. Okay, so maybe I can start by a pre-question. Maybe Angela and Kevin can help again kick this off. Are there any common mistakes that applicants make at interview stage that we could learn from? Okay.
I think one very basic one is not taking the situation seriously, and assuming that it's all casual and it's not, it's an interview. If you've been asked to come for an interview, come for an interview and be prepared to answer questions in a serious manner, even if you know the person or the people that are interviewing you. Yeah, don't assume that it's just a chat for the sake of having a chat.
Absolutely, yeah. Anybody else? Kevin?
Well, I guess don't pre-prepare word for word answers for questions that you think people might ask you because you sound robotic. But also just bear in mind that for most of these interviews, you don't know the people. You might know in your heart what an amazing PhD candidate you're going to be. You might have all of these properties, but the only thing that they know about you is what they've read in the application and what you say to them in the interview. And so actually making sure that if you really have very positive points that show why you're really suited to this, or how keen you are, or you're interested in it, or how your background matches it, you've got to make sure that comes across in the interview. And that means a little bit about thinking about the questions you're being asked and how you can get your good points into it. And also bear in mind at the end, if there's things you think haven't come across, people will usually ask you if you've got anything else you'd like to say or any questions. And that's a good point if you think, oh, well, we haven't covered this bit. Why don't I bring up that I've got experience of this very technique that is going to be the pillar of this, or whatever, and things like that. So I think just going in and hoping for the best and that, yeah, I'll be myself and that'll come through is the way not to get appointed. You've got to do quite a bit of prep to get you in that zone. And the other way I kind of talk about revising for that is to think of it as bullet points rather than a paragraph you prepared. I need to make sure when they ask me about my experience, I get across these 3 points. When they ask me about how I work well in a team, I've got these 2 examples I can give where, or this is the quality I value most in a team, and I can show that I learned this during my placement here. Things like that. And just make sure then they come sort of readily to mind, but not in an overly practiced way. I would also say, while I'm on, make sure you look at who's on the interview panel. People tend to have interests and they might ask you some general questions, but it comes from a particular point. So if you've got somebody who's a statistician on the panel, and you're talking about your past research work, they may well ask you what statistical approach you used and why, for example. And similarly, if what you did touched on immunology, but it wasn't the main focus, but you've got an immunologist on the panel, they're probably going to ask you about the immunology aspects. So make sure you've got something to say to those people.
No, that's very good advice.
It's
I'm sorry, Myra, go ahead.
No, Myra, you go next, because you'll be.
Liz and I can wax lyrical about this for hours. I was just going to say that students worry about all sorts of things like experience and qualifications and what they've read and who they've met and all the rest of it. And actually, they forget the very basics. And I read somewhere in one of these marketing books that an interview is actually determined within the first 30 seconds of somebody walking into a room. And I've put this to the test umpteen times when I've given people a mock interview when they haven't been able to get a job, for example, and they've come up to my dining room and I've got them to knock the door and come in, and you know immediately why they haven't got the job. They just walk in with their head down, they don't make eye contact, they look resentful that they're there, and that's only because they're nervous. You have to look as if you're interested in being there, that you're going to enjoy the next 15 minutes or whatever it is, that you're interested in your panel, look them in the eye, look them up and down, make your own assessment of them. I think that's really important. And for God's sake, turn up kind of smart. You don't have to be a fashion person, but, you know, be clean, your hair tidy, your shirt iron, not hanging out your backside like Boris Johnson, you know, just be smart as if you were taking it seriously. And that's not a snobby thing. It's because you show respect to the panel and they will appreciate that. And you show respect to the institute that you're applying to too. So these simple things that are within your control are just as important as all the experience in the world. And I'm sure Liz is going to agree with me.
Yes, I absolutely agree. And in terms of clothing, is you want to be remembered for your great interview, not for what you're wearing. And so something that's fairly neutral. I've been to so many interviews where people have turned up. Well, one person turned up in a light up Santa Claus tie. Big mistake. I can still remember him. He didn't get offered the job, but I still remember the light up Santa Claus tie. So not a good thing. I think I'm saying the same as I think. Just prepare, because sometimes interviews can be quite a long gap from when you've applied. So refresh yourself on what the scholarship is, or the studentship is, or the PhD is, what you actually wrote. So refresh yourself on that. Do behave professionally. And it is, don't worry if you're nervous, because I think actually nerves gives you a little bit of zing. So don't worry about that, but behave professionally. So for example, when you walk into them, you need to remember often with interviews, I've interviewed a whole day panel, so you might be the 9th candidate, and we've been in this room for like 8 hours, not quite 8 hours, and so they are watching you, and so when you walk in, it's not about, well, actually we've had this, not about high-fiving people or hiring everyone and hi or anything like that. It's actually ground yourself, sit down, and go for the interview. Arrive early. So no one will thank you, because often panels, they are interviewing 8 to 10 people in one day. So just do not arrive late, because you might actually miss your slot. Handshaking, not normal, because if you've got a panel, they're stuck around the table. I did see someone who basically hurled themselves across the table because the candidate insisted on shaking hands, and just don't do any of that. Remember the people have been in the room for a long time if you're fairly late in the day, and you want to stand out as being an excellent candidate, but for the right reasons, like come in like with a breath of fresh air, but just behave very professionally. In terms of don't make the panel join the dots. So I mentioned earlier, for the Future Leaders Fellowships, we had 9 candidates and we got 8. 9 shortlisted, we got 8. And the one who didn't get shortlisted and he didn't seek advice, he literally said, "My maths will speak for itself." And all I could say is something did speak for itself, but it certainly wasn't his maths. So things like that, just be really careful about. Do look people up, but don't make judgments about people. So I'm very, very frequently the only woman on an all-male panel, and I've had some interestingly, assumptions about why I'm there. So don't make assumptions about the people that are there that if you haven't looked them up. And the final thing I'll say is, if you can, have a mock interview. So we do mock interviews, and we do them, they are really serious. So the feedback we often get is the mock interview is a lot more stressful and a lot more difficult than actually the real interview is, because we run it as a real interview. I'm sure Moira does as well.
Yeah.
There's something else, Lucky, if I could just interject.
Of course.
Liz mentioned it in passing, but anything you write in your application, whether it's the covering letter or your CV or your application form, every word in that is fair game for the panel. It means that they will ask you in-depth questions about any sentence that you've written there. So for God's sake, don't turn up at your interview not remembering what your final year project was, because they're going to give you almost an examination like a viva to find out what you've done, to see whether you're on top of it and you know what you were doing. So do yourself a favor and know everything that you've written down, and be prepared to answer questions on it.
Yeah. Angela had her hand up, but she seems to have disappeared from my screen. Angela, are you still there? She dropped off the line.
She might be back.
Yeah, I found it kept crashing for me earlier. I had a period where I had to restart my computer and come back in. But I don't know what it was.
We're not paying the broadband bill. That's the problem.
Yeah, just in terms of just other things about interviews is that, you know, go in to have the interview and then just get some fresh air afterwards. There's nothing worse than you have the interview and then you completely revisit it. And I should have said this and I should have said that and should have done this. And I always say to people, walk into the room. If you've prepared enough, you've done a lot of preparation, you know your stuff, and you're wearing stuff that makes you feel comfortable, you walk in, knock it to them and walk out. That's the best position you can be in.
Sure. There's a question that came up in the questions, and actually it's a very good one, I feel, because it's about, and actually when you look at quite a lot of the doctoral training programs and how they're recruiting, at least I did the initial interview. Oh, here's Angela now. Angela, so you had your hand up and then you disappeared.
Sorry, my computer crashed. I don't want to repeat anything that's already said, so it's okay.
Feel free to say what you were going to say.
I was just gonna say it's the same advice that people are asking about the initial emails, and that's be enthusiastic, and know why you're applying for what you're applying for. Because the worst thing is if you say, well, why do you want this? And the person says, well, I want to do a PhD. And you say, okay, but why this PhD? And they don't really know because they just want to do a PhD. It leaves a very bad impression. So being enthusiastic about that role is really key.
Absolutely. Brilliant. Okay, so the question I was beginning to just introduce is actually, and this occurs a lot now, particularly for interviewing overseas students. It's about interviews online. So really, this question is asking any tips or advice for conveying good body language or presentation over an online interview? What are the crucial factors which may help to deliver a good interview online? Anybody want to give some advice on that?
Yeah, I can.
Yeah.
So some interviews that are coming up. So Faculty of Engineering for their Imperial College Research Fellowships interviews, the panel are all in the room, but the candidates are all coming in online, which and that's happened for the last couple of years. I think my advice is plain background. So there's a couple of you, Jeffrey, you've got a lovely plain background. Wear what you'd wear for the interview. So just, you know, get into that space. Closed doors. So there's no marauding cats, children, dogs, whatever. And make sure the quality is good. And practice if you've got to share your screen, the volume, that again, have a mock interview to practice that. So we did this a few years ago with someone. They had the interview and they said, oh, his camera wasn't working, and so was doing lots of gesturing, and when he was asked questions he was like, I don't know what the answer to that is. And then at the end of the interview he said, oh, it's a shame my camera wasn't working, and the panel said it was. so they could see everything. So just practice it and practice the sharing, and just think of yourself as you, again, not to be distracted. I normally don't blur my background, but so that there's nothing distracting you. Look like Jeffrey looks, just plain white background or just a very plain background, and practice, just practice.
Yeah, I think obviously, we're all much more familiar with presenting and talking in online, but there is this sense that you are somewhat disconnected from some of the people you're talking to, particularly if it's a panel, and like today, they're all individually separate on the screen. It is a difficult skill to be able to convey things like your enthusiasm and so on. But I think if you've got a camera and it's working, moving and pointing and things, and I think it's always good, isn't it? It always shows a degree of enthusiasm, and engagement. Angela.
I think be aware of the fact that if you're in a different time zone, the lighting is important. It may be dark where you are, and so check the lighting in the room that you're going to be in, and try to talk to the camera, because it seems weird because you can see people in other places, but
Yes.
if you're online, you actually need to talk to the camera, which means you're not necessarily looking here, there, and everywhere. And there is, I think, an increasing tendency for people to want to say, I'm online, therefore I can have notes everywhere around my computer. Be aware of the fact the panel can see you doing that. They can see if you're trying to do this and this. And it's really best to try and interview as if you were in the room.
I think that's absolutely right. I was going to make the point about notes and actually using those. Using notes is kind of fine in the sense that, just prompts and things, but actually reading text, it's gonna be obvious you're doing that from the point of view of an online interview, and it may not create the best impression of how you can convey yourself in that context. Any other points on that front?
It's just to really reiterate the basics. I was interviewing a student a few weeks ago who wanted to return to study after an interruption. And, the panel wanted to know whether this student was ready to take up her studies again for a period of illness. And there were all kinds of bad signs from the start, like joining late, flickery connection, turning the camera on a bit reluctantly, not really giving the impression of someone who was now sorted out in their lives and ready to face the challenges. So I think we are all expected to be able to handle the online world now. And I think people will make fewer allowances than they might once have done if it seems that you can't hold up your end of the conversation online. Some Vivas are now done online, which I think would be terrible because, particularly when it's your PhD, your career, you'd like to be in the room, I think, with the examiners to use your body to convey your personality. Those cues are not available to you. It's a handicap for both sides. It's a handicap for both the panel and the interviewee. But I think as long as everyone's aware of that, then being interviewed online shouldn't put you at a disadvantage. But follow all the rules you've heard about, as dressing as though you were attending and being there as though you mean it.
So certainly for PhD Vivas now at Imperial, we've gone back to doing them live. Doing them online is an exception, and you have to make a case for it. That's not necessarily true of actually all the master's courses. Nasheen.
Thank you, Lucky. There's a question that I think others would value hearing the answer to.
Yes.
In the Q&A, which is how to express your interest to pursue a PhD in a field in which you don't have any prior experience.
Yes,
so
I was going to
if
come
you,
to
for
that.
example, you have wet lab experience.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah,
I can see that question. And in fact, I thought there was a related question as well in the pre-questions, which is really all about showing how best to convey your interest to pursue a particular PhD in an area that you either are not fully conversant with, but actually focusing down on perhaps the skills needed, the skill set. Anyone want to pick up on that?
I think that's about pulling together the threads of some of the things we've talked about earlier, like, you know, the tenacity question. Do you understand what research is like? Do you understand what research is like in that field? You know, if you want to persuade me that you're coming from a completely unrelated field, you know, perhaps you're a geographer who now wants to do molecular biology, then I will perhaps need a lot of persuading, but you perhaps don't need to overestimate what the gap is. You know, if you did biotechnology and you now want to do molecular biology, that's not such a big gap. So just because your degree title doesn't have that precise wording on it, I think what in science, what we're most interested in is problems, frontiers, solving them, and having the drive and the personality type to do that. It's less about whether you've used a particular kind of microtome before. And I think if you show awareness of that lab and its priorities and its approaches, and whether you can situate yourself in that, can you imagine yourself doing that work? And you know, having a peer-to-peer conversation about that, I think that would take you a long way.
Angela, thank you, Jeffrey. Angela.
I always think it's about the why. So if somebody says they want to do a degree in a particular topic and it's not exactly what they've done before, then presumably they didn't pluck that out of the air. Presumably they came to that through some process of logical thought, which is really important in a PhD. So if they can convey how they got to that conclusion and maybe also what they've done to try and ensure that that's what they want to do, because a PhD is a big commitment. So whether they've, I don't know, done one of the MOOCs that are online, or whether they've done some reading in a particular area to demonstrate that this really is an area they want to commit to, then that's absolutely fine. It's just why, and what have you done? How did you get there?
Yeah, no, that's right. There are some elements to PhD interviewing for PhD places that give opportunities for students to demonstrate both enthusiasm and talk about the technical skills that they have and technical skills they want to acquire. The first is, quite often you'll be asked to talk about whatever research you've done before, either the project or asked to identify a particular piece of research that you've been involved with and talk about that. You may get the opportunity to use a whiteboard. You're unlikely to be asked, unless specifically told, that you can use slides. So be ready to talk about this work, but try and talk about it in a way that's engaging. So if it is a field that is not the field that the PhD is about, try and make sure that the people you're speaking to, the panel you're speaking to, understand your enthusiasm for what you've done before, that it's not just simply dismissed as something that you had to do, and the outcomes and, you know, where it all might go. I think that's one opportunity. The other opportunity is you might be given a piece of scientific literature to discuss with the panel, something given in advance, a paper or a review, and you'll be asked to come and give a summary of that, a précis of that, perhaps even to talk about what the importance of that. And actually that can be also outside of your field, and it's really primarily to get you to talk about science, but show your enthusiasm for science. And then the third thing is that you may be given a copy of the actual research proposal that was used for the PhD. And again, you may be asked in depth about what aspects of this are interesting to you. Have you got particular skills and so on. So these are things that happen fairly frequently, but there will always be an opportunity in a structured component of the interview where the student or the candidate is able to convey that enthusiasm and that ability to show that they can conduct science and problem solve, the kind of things that Jeffrey, I think, was indicating just then. Okay, so I think we don't have any more questions about the interview, but there's still a few other questions that come in. Maybe we can just go through those, because I think Yeah, okay. So this one actually goes back to the actual application itself. It's a question about the personal statement. It's a question that says, when writing a personal statement, is it more relevant to tell a story on how you became interested in this area and what you've learned, or from your experiences, or should we focus more on what the opportunity would provide us with? What would happen if you were able to get on the program or the PhD, and how that would drive your career? It's kind of how to balance those two things. Do we have any advice on that? Is telling a story always a good thing?
Okay, I'm not a great fan of personal statements.
Fine.
So unless you have to, I wouldn't, because often, say, a personal statement at the top of a CV is basically saying the same thing as your CV. They often are very generic. So I could write personal statements for everybody here, because they're not, there's nothing there. If you have to write personal statements, so again, golden rules is first person. So I, me, my. Not third person. Third person just reads really weird. Although some people would, that's a way that some people would do it. But it's, if it's your personal statement, it's your personal statement. So I, me. Tell a story only if it's relevant. But it's really, it's the sort of just in time, it's what you're applying for and how that's relevant and what you are interested in, rather than, you know, when I was 12 I got a chemistry set. So I'm just not a great fan of them, to be honest.
I couldn't agree
Sorry.
more. Yeah,
Sorry,
I agree.
Does anybody want to support the personal statement? Jeffrey, you got your hand up. Let's see.
Well, sometimes you're asked to write one, and then again,
Yes.
follow the rules, do what it says, but maintain the distinction between the CV, which is how you got to this point, and the personal statement, which I think is more forward pointing. It's saying, well, because I've got this experience, then I think I would fit your lab, your research program, your institute, because. So, and again, I wouldn't make it drift over several pages. You know, one hardworking page of A4 about why you think you're a good fit for this program and how you think you distinguish yourself from the other candidates. At the top of a CV, no, please don't put that stuff. Certainly not the empty bragging, all that rubbish about I am driven, I am committed, I am, you know, all of those words that come out of bad careers advice manuals. It turns people off, frankly, and it prejudices the reader against the rest of your CV, which might be very good.
Yeah. As I think, as Katie mentioned, and obviously Angela and Kevin know, in our TTP we've got rid of the personal statement, and instead we've gone for a series of questions, providing space. So they're structured questions, providing space for the students to respond to those. They give us an opportunity to understand more about the student than a personal statement would do, their motivations, their skill sets, what they hope to achieve by becoming onto the program. And we're seeing more and more of that as being best practice within the sector, actually.
And can I say on that, Lucky, we've done the same thing on a program that I'm involved with. And what we're finding is that some of the students who objectively are high performing, so they've got very good CVs and lots of experience and very good degrees, they actually find the short questions a bit of a struggle because they're not used to presenting themselves in that way. So if you do find yourself, students, facing one of these short answer structured statements, or whether it's something about your situational judgment, please follow the rule and answer the questions. Don't just shoehorn what you think is your CV or the story you want to tell into those question boxes.
I think that's right. What's really nice, and we've only been doing this now for a couple of years, is we're not seeing generic responses anymore. We are actually seeing responses which you can convince yourself are actually coming from the students who've sat down and thought about what they want to be saying in these different bits. So again, as I say, you know, this is not by all means universal, but more and more institutions and doctoral training programs are adopting this kind of approach. And then there are scholarship schemes which require a personal statement, and also in addition to that, something written by the student about the project work they're going to do. Again, the classic examples being the China Scholarship Scheme and the President's Scholarship, which require a personal statement and then a description of what the project's going to be and how the student has already become engaged in helping design that project. Okay. Okay, so we got. I think I'm going to finish off with this question because this is a question which I can certainly help answer, and it's a student who's a candidate's asked, I'm not sure what I want to do, but all PhD deadlines seem to be all in November, December. Can you still get into a funded PhD later in the year? Are there applications in spring? So actually, the answer to that question is that what you're seeing probably opening at this time of year are the doctoral training programs, because they are trying to get students while they're either still engaged with their postgraduate degrees or have just come off them and are considering doing a PhD leading to a research career. But in the academic year that follows, PhD opportunities occur all the time. So the awards of PhDs coming through specific scholarships, as I've said, that happens all the way throughout the year, as do PhD opportunities that arise in research groups, some of which will get funded because grants are getting funded, some of them because there's contract work in collaboration with industry, and these do not follow the academic cycle. So the thing to do is always keep an eye on the web pages. So we have web pages at Imperial that advertise PhD opportunities, but also things like findaphd.com, and you'll see PhDs advertised right throughout the year. The programs largely recruit according to the academic cycle, partly because they have to fit with the academic cycle, particularly ones where there's a master's course that then feeds into the PhD. So they have to start when the masters start. So that's really the situation for that. I don't know if anybody wants to add to that.
I would just say to recommend using the scholarship search tool.
Yes.
To look for opportunities throughout the year.
That's one of the college web pages. Yeah. Yep. Thank you. Yep. Somebody else was, I think.
I think the other thing is
Angela.
don't panic apply. Don't think, oh my gosh, all the opportunities are right now. I just have to throw an application that's not well formed into those, because it's not a good use of your time or the panel's time. And if you apply, if you just spam people with applications and then you find one that you really think is going to work and it's at the same place, they might say, well, this is a bit weird because we've seen this application before and it wasn't actually for this. So be selective and don't panic.
Absolutely don't panic. And even sorry, Kevin.
Sorry, I was just going to say, I guess some of the programs also have fairly wide intake where they're not expecting you to have fastened on a very specific PhD at that point. And I guess, to be fair, the MRC, the multi-site DTP, has an aspect that some people coming in with a very good idea of what they want to do, but some people come in with a very general area that they're interested in because it has the preliminary MRes year. So there are programs like that as well. And for those, you might well think about applying early, even if you're not very sure exactly what it is you want to do.
That's right. And there are late additions to programs. So the CRIC has its block recruitment now-ish, but actually throughout the year, there will be PhD opportunities that will arise where students are recruited to join that cohort, even though they're not recruited in that block. And again, with the multi-site, we'll be recruiting to case studentships in the middle of the year, which are not part of the current call. There'll be another call to go with that. So there are usually plenty of opportunities distributed throughout the year. Okay, so I would like to say that we've really enjoyed discussing all of this today on the panel. All the questions that come in, we'll try and get some sort of response to them, including the ones that we haven't discussed with the panel today. If there's any follow-up questions, then feel free to email us. There will be a survey sent out to students, the students who have registered. We value your feedback because that's really important to us, particularly in understanding how these these sessions are viewed and how we can maybe improve them, or can improve them, and moving into the future. Apart from that, I guess all that's left for me to do is to wish you all the best of luck in your applications for PhDs or whatever you're then going to move on to do. So, just following your career. And there are always people at Imperial here to help you with that. So please reach out and people will be happy to help. All right, so then with that, I'd like to draw today to a close. Thank you so much to the panel. Thank you particularly to Liz and to Katie in her absence for wonderful presentations. And as Myra said, you should take these presentations and carry them with you for life because they are going to help you for many years to come. All right. Thank you, everybody. Cheers.
Bye-bye.